Good morning, everyone. You are all very, very welcome to join us this morning at the Centre for Liberal Arts of Northern Essex Community College. Today we have Professor Christoph Strobel of UMass Lowell, and you may discern that Christoph is from just slightly east of me, and you may discern that as we move along. He is the author of Native Americans of New England, the Global Atlantic from 1400 to 1900, The Testing Grounds of Modern Empire, which and he co-authored with Alice Nash, Daily Life of Native Americans from Post-Columbian through 19th-Century America. And he has 3 books on immigration. So there is nobody better fixed to address this topic within our area. And I'm not sure whether he appreciates having been volunteered by his colleague to talk on this, but I am very pleased that he is joining with us and is going to speak on this topic that kind of blew up in the Haverhill area in the last year to year and a half. And so I let him take it away and talk all about it. Thank you, Professor Strobel.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. McDermott, for having me. Yeah, I'm thrilled to be here. I'm trying to see if I can go to share screen and let me know if this is working or not. Maybe it's not. Can you see that on the? Because I can't see anything at this point.
No, I can't, and I have allowed you to share.
Share screen, I know. Let me see if I can do this again. Sometimes my computer does weird things, and it's been giving me, yeah, that sounds like it might.
What's happening? There we go.
Yeah, that it might now let me. Okay, well, from beginning. Yes, so thank you, Dermot, for having me, and it's my great pleasure and honor. And I think as everyone in the global pandemic that we're in right now, balancing childcare, taking care of elderly relatives, we're all kind of going crazy while we're working from home, and we're the fortunate ones that maybe can work from home and maybe we not, and we're exposed. But I'm glad we can make this happen via Zoom. And so what I'm going to do today is pretty much try to give a talk in the next 45 minutes that provides you with a quick introduction to Native American history, but using, and given the shortness of time, we I think have 55 minutes, and I want to leave some time for questions too. I might let Columbus go because that debate is way established and everyone knows more about it. But for today, I just want to use kind of the symbols of the Massachusetts State Seal and Haverhill Hannah Duston and what they might mean to Native Americans, but also those of us who study a lot of Native American history. And they're sort of strong reminders of kind of a settler colonial past and sort of a settler colonial narrative. And that's what I'm trying to address here in the talk today, is how they are kind of maybe juxtaposed to actual realities, and they're really diametrically opposed to the Native American history that happened. And so there's a lot of myth making that is captured by these symbols. And so maybe rather than talk about it in platitudes, let's move right in and look at the seal of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And feel free to put questions in the chat, or if you want to hold on, we're a small enough group that we can definitely take questions at the end. Dermot is in charge of that, but I'm sure it's with like few people, it's no problem. Let's hope we're not having any Zoom bombers. and Zoom jokes are even lamer than my jokes in real life. So anyway, so on the right-hand side, you have the historic seal, the 17th century seal of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. I've been showing this seal for to my students for over 20 years. It's always fascinated me. And students usually pick up, oh my God, that's so racist. The Native American is completely and utterly naked, covered in a couple of leaves. And then the speech bubble comes out and says, come over and help us. It doesn't get any more imperial than that, even by English standards. It's pretty much in your face. And students very much appreciate that. They pick up on that, and we've got great discussions usually. The seal on the left-hand side, which is our contemporary seal, that was designed in the late 19th century. And while the Native American is dressed, might seem at first glance as a more respectful presentation, there is a couple of woozies in that one too. So first off, we're really dealing actually with a Frankenstein construction of a Native American. The body that you see here on the picture is based on that of an archaeological dig pulled out of a Native American person in Winthrop. But the designer, a fellow named Edmund Garrett, decided that the indigenous people that he found in Massachusetts were just not Native American looking enough. And so he decided to use the head of a model from Montana that he thought was more Native American looking than the people he could find in indigenous communities in Massachusetts. So that in itself, you have the head and the body that are disjointed. To add sort of insult to injury, you have the sword hanging above the head of the Native American, which is kind of a little bit of a weird symbolism here too. And said sword belonged to Miles Standish, who was the first military leader, the first go-to guy when fights needed to be carried to Native Americans in Plymouth Colony. So the Plymouth Puritans, or separatists, hired Miles Standish as sort of their guy to provide military leadership. So Miles Standish might have not used the said sword that you see here in the picture, but he had decapitated various Native Americans in battle, and those were piked out side Plymouth plantation on the fence to be displayed. So again, to Native people, you look at the sword, you look at the disjointed head, it's kind of a bit offensive. Speaking of heads being chopped off, the belt that is being used on the picture is based on a belt that it's not, I don't think it's currently at Harvard Museum, but it usually is at the Peabody Museum at Harvard. That's King Philip's belt, and King Philip's led a rebellion, or what the English called a rebellion, what Native Americans usually refer to as a war of resistance against the Puritan colonists. And King Philip, like several other indigenous leaders during this war, had his head cut off, and that was piked outside of Plymouth for over 20 years. And so this is the kind of symbolism that a lot of Native people and a historian like me sees when I walk out of my office and I see the Massachusetts state flag hanging outside there. And for 2 decades, my students have heard me complain about it. And sometimes I'm very proud that when I teach this class, sometimes the flag disappears. I don't know why, and I'm not saying it was me, but here we go. To make a long story short, the icing on the cake, and there's a couple more. We could talk about the bow, but hey, I think we've got only a few more minutes left, so in the interest of moving along, the state motto starts out, "By the sword we seek peace," and this in itself encapsulates New England's Indigenous relations quite nicely, as we'll explore later in the talk, because the sword and warfare very much helped in establishing New England. And that's one of those historical legacies we need to have more conversations about and should be talking about, as now people are starting to say, well, maybe we need to get rid of the seal. But rather than just getting rid of things, we should also have a more public debate about these issues and use this as a teachable moment rather than just sweep it under the rug. So now my computer mouse is starting to freeze again. It does that every now and then, so please bear with me. Technology is, anyway, that was another disaster. Like you, Dermot, with your Wi-Fi, I had some computer issues to troubleshoot this morning. Here she is, Hannah Duston. These two statues, one which folks in Haverhill will be quite familiar with. It's in the center of town. I've seen this one multiple times, although I haven't been to Haverhill since COVID and since the controversy exploded. The other Hannah statue is up outside of Manchester, New Hampshire. And down there, you can see in the corner on her knee as she carries the scalp of a Native American is a little bit of red color, because during the demonstrations there had been some vandalism, as we're accustomed to with the Columbus statue as well. So Hannah Duston is, it's my understanding, is the first woman in North America, or at least in the United States. I can't speak for Canada, and I shouldn't speak for Canada. The first woman in the United States that was part of a statue. And so that's great. But the history of the statue is, in a sense, somewhat similar in the point of its origin to the ones that are created in the South, the Civil War statues there. And so it's roughly the time of the late 19th century when the United States is tied up with a long history of white supremacy. And just as these symbols are put up all over the South, this one is the same kind of quality of work, often not very good, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And to Indigenous people, especially in this area, Hannah Duston is a little bit of a firebrand. Now, I'm not one that is easily, I mean, some people bash Hannah Duston, which I think is unfair. I mean, she experienced traumatic trauma. She was captured. She lost a child during capture and then was abducted to be taken up to Canada, which was the destiny of a lot of English that were captured by Franco-Indigenous forces. What we tend to forget, though, that the Indigenous piece of the Franco-Indigenous forces were often people that had lived in the Merrimack Valley and that had been, to use a modern term, ethnically cleansed out of the region, had lost their land. And so they, of course, from their perspective, had very much an axe to grind with the communities there. And settling up in communities in northern New England or Canada, they told people about their experience and making Native Americans up north understandably very nervous about what English colonization might mean to them. To make a long story short, at the place where you see the statue on the left, an island right next to the Merrimack River, north of Manchester, New Hampshire, Hannah Duston, with two other captives, decided to go after the party that she had left with. And when I talk about party, and this is where the Hannah Duston story becomes problematic, there is really one man of fighting age, an older man, two women, and 7 children. And Hannah Duston and her allies, the New English captives, proceed to kill the man of fighting age first, the old men next, the two women, and then proceed to kill 6 of the 7 children. And then they scalped the bodies of the Native Americans. And while we are in local lore are often used to hearing about the scalping done by Native Americans, in fact, in New England, it's very much a policy pushed for by the colonial officials and by the governments. Scalping becomes a way for someone like Hannah Duston to prove, I have killed Native Americans, in this case, 6 children and 2 women and 2 adults. And then they brought the scalps to Boston and they were paid. So by the sword we seek peace is very much a scalping, freebooting warfare that's very much part of our history of colonization in New England that we tend to not talk about very much. And so as a historian, as I see Hannah holding a scalp, or I see her holding an axe, that is the kind of symbolism that comes to my mind. And again, that is, as with the seal, I think there needs to be more public debate about what do these statues, what does the seal mean? Rather than just taking them down and get rid of them, we also need to have a conversation of what this means to our history and how we teach our history, or maybe more accurately, how we ignore a lot of our valid history. Anyway, so for the last, and here's another, the Columbus statue, but I think everyone is so aware of the Columbus controversy because it's been talked about a lot, and in the interest of time, because I've talked both about Hannah and the state seal for about 10 minutes, I want to move on and sort of provide a little bit of a historic background that sort of counterposes the Indigenous experience to sort of these histories that the statues represent. All right, so when you read popular settler histories and New English histories about New England, there are certain very powerful legacies that have very much shaped the way we in this region look at Native Americans. And so we have this myth of that the Puritans arrived in a wilderness. They took over virgin land that was covered by just a few nomadic Native Americans. And when you study the archaeological record, which I happened to do quite a bit during my last project and continue to do so, it's fantasy land. So when we look at Indigenous society in New England, we're looking at a region of tremendous ecological stability. In fact, when we are thinking about the challenges that we might face with global warming and more sustainable ways of living, Indigenous people, not only in New England, but really all over the Americas, might provide us some very solid answers to how to work the land, use maritime resources, use the rivers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The Native American world in New England was one of social complexity. People were not quote unquote nomads. They were farming. They were agricultural societies, which is why their land became very desired by New English settlers, because Native Americans knew and occupied the most fertile farmland. Native Americans, because there's no domesticatable animals in the Northeast other than the dog, needed to figure out ways to bring protein into their diet. So they used brilliant ways of fishing the Merrimack River. Whenever there's a waterfall, Native Americans will build out scaffolding and fish salmon and other fish during spawning season. They collected shellfish in the rivers, lakes, and the oceans. So they were brilliant fishermen, but they were also brilliant, what the New England records call hunters. But because there's no animals that can be raised to be domesticated, Native Americans needed to hunt for meat. But rather than just wandering off in the quote unquote wilderness, as the Puritans might have you believe, and then settler apologist historians in the 19th century and early 20th century, like Francis Parkman, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Native Americans had actually quite ingenious ways of land management. So they burned the undergrowth in the woods, making it much easier to aim for their targets, but also regenerating a lot of growth of grasses and plants that then spurred further animal population growth. So in a sense, yes, they are quote unquote hunting in a sense, but if we market this differently, we would have a landscape management to spur the growth of animal population. So we really have a free range pasturing system if we would market it in a different way. Now, the Puritan observers choose not to do so, and that's their prerogative. But from an archaeological perspective, there is a lot of land management that is going on. Native Americans in the Northeast participate in long distance exchange networks before the coming of Europeans that stretch all over the North American landmass. And we have over 10 millennia of history here. So that is what's going on in the pre-contact period. But sort of what happens with the legacies of colonization, the coming of the Mayflower and the Massachusetts Bay Colony is a dramatic shift in what's going on. I mentioned that Native Americans did not have domesticated animals. And that had a dramatic impact on the disease history of the Americas. Because we share most of our diseases with animal populations, the Native American disease environment in the Western Hemisphere was quite different from that of Europe. And with the coming of European, there was a huge introduction of new disease that Native Americans had no immunity to. And it seems pretty clear, at least in the New England case, looking at the record, that as much as 90% of the population had died by the time the colonists had established a foothold by the 1650s. So there's one way of epidemic that happens after the other. And many of these epidemics hit even before, for example, Plymouth Plantation is established. In fact, Plymouth is built on the site of another Native American settlement. And when you read the accounts of the Puritan separatists carefully, they talk about how there's human bones dispersed around. The farm fields had already been cut. There's leftover parts of wetus, the structures. So there is big evidence of a prior occupation of Plymouth, and that this land had been cleared by Native Americans that had then fallen victim to disease brought over by Europeans. In fact, Champlain, who traveled in the region just a little bit north of a decade before the Puritan established their colony, had talked about a settlement, Pawtucket, he talked about a settlement that had been, he referred to it as a trade entrepot, and I'm sorry, I think I said Pawtucket, I might have misspoken, Patuxet, sorry, and described it as a major trade entrepot that was settled by several thousand people. So these are clues that we have in the historic record. As a historian, I'm also very much shocked by the bones and the skulls on the ground. Because what I've learned about Native American culture in the Northeast, it's the bones of your ancestors that are sacred. And this is why Native Americans in the Northeast, but also in other parts of North America, are very protective of their grave sites. It's a sacred site, for lack of a better word, that should not be violated. And by human remains being left behind at Patuxent, we clearly understand that something most horrible must have happened here. That Native Americans had been unable, or maybe too scared, or felt threatened by supernatural forces. We don't know. There's all kinds of theories we can spin, and we'll never get the right answer. That they would not come back to bury their dead. Maybe the entire population had died out, or the people that had been able to flee had been too scared to come back after what they've seen happening. And so we get a sense that right as the Mayflower arrives, we have a society in shock that is suffering under the impact of massive epidemic waves and is very much dealing with a dramatic population decline, because the epidemics continue as the Puritan colonization of New England progresses. More epidemics in the 1630s, 1650s, and the mass dying continues. I want to bring it back again to Pawtucket, because this also is a good way of teaching us about another, like disease. The other thing that we often tend to neglect when we study Native American history is how Native American history is connected to the history of American slavery. And in fact, several historians of New England Indigenous history would argue, and it's a big debate in the field right now, that slavery plays a most central role in the founding of American history. So I'm sorry, not that Native American slavery plays a very founding role in the establishment of slavery. All right, let me take a step back. The most famous person from Patuxent is probably a guy named Squanto, or Tisquantum, and Squanto was sort of the diminutive that has been sort of used in popular use. And Squanto had been a guy that had been captured. The guy who captured him, Hunt, who was affiliated, one of the officer of John Smith of Pocahontas fame, had been just one of many slave raiders that had picked up and captured people across the New England coast for about probably at least up to 100 years before the coming of the Mayflower. And Squanto was the guy that went into the Atlantic slave market, was rescued by a bunch of Franciscan friars in Spain. They just grabbed him and ended up with a rich investor in Britain who was a major investor in the New England Company, and made his way back to the New World through various steps. But Squanto is only one of several thousands of Native Americans that were captured, or hundreds or thousands, who knows, that was captured into slavery. The other way that Native American history matters in the history of slavery of the United States is happening during the Pequot War. Now, the Pequot War is sort of a messed up affair, and even the biggest apologists of Puritan colonization in recent years say, oh yeah, no, that was just really bad. The Puritans, in a way to come to control what is called the wampum trade. These are little beads that Native Americans use for trade. And in fact, the New English used wampum beads for currency until the 1650s. They go after a nation called the Pequot that has a dominant role, supposedly in this wampum trade, and they hit the Pequot hard. There's a nasty massacre at Mystic, Connecticut, where over 500, mostly women, children, and older people are just burned alive and massacred. This is just one of many massacres that are part of Indigenous colonial warfare. Now, the New English were assisted by their Mohegan and Narragansett allies, who were aspiring to also get a chunk in this wampum trade. To make a long story short, This is sort of the most egregious battle of the war, but the war goes on for almost 2 years, and it is accompanied by a lot of raiding and the capturing of Pequots that are then brought back to New England, or Massachusetts Bay Colony to be more exact, where they are worked as servants. And you have the New English elite, people like Governor Winthrop and others, that are writing back and forth. Well, you know, these people are war captives. And because as a reparation, we can use these people as war captives to work as our servants. But didn't the Romans turn war captives into slaves? And do we therefore not have the legal right and even the obligation to turn these people into slaves? So this is a heated debate in the English colony at the time. Several of the Pequots are also sold on the Atlantic slave market, and with the profits the Puritan elite makes, they're bringing in people of African descent. And all of a sudden, by the 1640s, we have a majority Native American servants, a majority African servants, and Massachusetts Bay Colony becomes, to make a long story short, as a result of the Pequot War, as a result of this trading, as a result of the bringing in of Africans, becomes the first colony, English colony in North America to legalize slavery. And slavery in this context means people of Native American descent, as well as people of African descent. And this population starts to intermix, and there's a long, complex history of African Indigenous or Afro-Indigenous interaction in Massachusetts as a result of that. But again, the creation of slavery in the 1640s is tied up also to the history of colonization of Native Americans. There's the issue of dispossession of land, dismantling of communities, but Native Americans also display a lot of adaptation, resilience, and they struggle very hard to maintain their sovereignty. And it's sort of emerging from this history. It's very interesting to note that we still have many Indigenous communities surviving in New England, despite all of that. By the sword we seek peace, the legacies of violence and war. The Pequot War was just one of many conflicts. The next one was King Philip's War in the 1670s. It's a very bloody and complicated story. To make a long story short, in southern New England, King Philip's War really breaks the neck of a lot of the Indigenous communities. To be fair, groups like the Mohegans, the Pequots, fight alongside the New English in this war. So the New English, in fact, some would argue, only survive because of Native American assistance, because you have the Mohegans, the Pequots, but you also have the Christian Native American communities, and then from the west you have the Mohawk Nation that goes after King Philip's with a vengeance. And the Mohawk Nation was part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy that some of you might know under the name of the Iroquois. And what the Iroquois were concerned about is that if Metacomet or King Philip should be successful against the New English, there would be another powerful confederacy that might compete with their interests. So to make a long story short, the Native American population is very much decimated by King Philip's War. But also it's an interesting study of how the English treat their Native American allies. For example, a lot of the Indigenous people from various communities, Christian communities in Eastern Massachusetts, for example, Natick, or where today Westford and Littleton are, there's a Neshoba and Nishawi community. They end up on Deer Island in a internment camp where many Native Americans perish. They're poorly supplied with food. They're not allowed to cut any of the wood that is there to build protective housing. So they're exposed in Boston Harbor in some of the roughest months of the year, not able to feed themselves or to protect themselves. At the end of the war, over 1,000 Native Americans are sold into Caribbean slavery, and the number might be as high as 2,000. Again, so this is when Native American see the state motto, by the sword we seek peace, and they raise questions about this. But the other important legacy of colonization that I want to talk a little bit about is also the story of survival, because the history of colonization, as in other parts of the world, is dire and is depressing and is brutal. But at the same time, people also persist and they try their best to survive. And so Native Americans in Southern New England continue to survive in the colonies as slaves and indentured servants. Christianity becomes a big reinforcing block in Indigenous communities. So among the Mohegan, Pequot, Narragansett, you have a growing Mashpee on Cape Cod. You have a growing number of Indigenous leaders like William Apis, Samson Occam, who are trained as ministers. And so they take on the spiritual role of a pastor in these communities, but they also are teachers to Native American students. And they also are political activists in their communities. For example, William Apis, who was a Pequot, helped in the 1830s in the Mashpee community on Cape Cod in their struggle when colonial, or in that point, sorry, Massachusetts state officials were trying to undermine the position of the Indigenous community there. So there's a lot of political activism that is connected to the role that Christianity, Indigenous Christianity, plays in the 18th and 19th century. Native Americans work in factories. Betsy Guppy Chamberlain, who you see here on the left, she was a factory worker in Lowell. She also wrote various pieces on Indigenous rights in the Lowell and the New England Offering. So people like Apis and Betsy Guppy Chamberlain reminded New Englanders, and it's interesting to pull out these pieces, that Native Americans were still very much a presence in New England, and they were not planning to go anywhere. Domestic labor, agriculture. When you read the accounts of, and again, maybe I'm stuck too much in Lowell, but I'm sure the same stuff happens in Haverhill. The mill girls write often about these Indian peddlers and Indian doctors and Indian performers that are showing up. And you have Native Americans that sell their medical services, that sell their baskets, they sell their brooms, but they also know that in order to sell more, they need to dress up in a way that mainstream New Englanders recognize them as Native Americans. So there's a performative piece here as well, that these mill girls are thrilled that Native Americans are showing up in traditional dress in canoes as they sail down the Merrimack, well, canoeing down the Merrimack River. But you get the picture. So a lot of this is also a performative piece that is in there. Native Americans in Northern New England, very active in the logging industry, river driving, so the people that take the trees down river, tourism trades, canoe making, the Penobscot and Passamaquoddy Indians in the early 20th century. It's still, if you want a high quality canoe built in the United States, you go and get it from the Penobscot Passamaquoddies. So this is where Native American survival continues. To make a long story short, this intermarriage with African Americans and the fact that a lot of Native Americans worked as soldiers, so they served in the American Revolution. All New England tribes fought alongside the Americans in the American Revolution. And you look at communities like the Stockbridge Indian, they paid a very high price in their military service. in terms of mortality rates, and bringing diseases back to their communities after they return from service. It's a very sad history. Another industry in which Native Americans in New England are very active is the whaling industry, which is also an industry with high mortality rates and extremely difficult working conditions. So what is happening increasingly in the 18th and 19th century, the male population declines, the female population declines less, the male population declines a lot more. And so Native American women find partners in other communities. So there's intermarriage with some white, especially recent immigrants, and with African Americans. And increasingly, the state of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut are looking at these communities, and they're convincing themselves, well, these are no longer Native American communities. We should not provide them with reserves. And what these states then do is they pass a policy of termination. And they're pretty much telling Native Americans, guess what? You are no longer Native Americans. We're closing down your reservations. Every one of you gets a piece of land. Here's some money, and you're on your own now. And Native Americans are saying, well, we've lived here forever. We've been in Mashpee. We've been in Connecticut. We've had our reserves. You can't just take them away from us. But it happens anyway. And there's very strong resistance, and Native Americans from the get-go take these cases to the court. And they're often struck down in the legal system. Native Americans are saying, well, you know what? The Constitution tells us that it's a federal prerogative to deal with Native American rights, and the state governments overstep their line. Then the judges say that is certainly a right interpretation of the Constitution, but we have what we call the colonial precedent. So for the longest time, the colonies, what used to be the colonies, are treated differently in federal Native American law, until a famous case that involves one of the Haudenosaunee nations. So a judge says this is garbage. The Constitution should apply to everyone equally, and that creates a whole lot of slews of lawsuits that has then also helped in New England to get federal recognition to some of the communities here. That said, there's a lot of Indigenous communities that are not federally recognized. Federal recognition is expensive. You need a lot of resources and research and evidence. And ultimately, it comes down to the point that you have to then ask mainstream society again to sort of, am I Native American or not? And so this becomes a very, it raises an ire in a lot of Native American communities as well. One of the people that has been quite active in this was a woman named Gladys Tantaquidgeon. And the Tantaquidgeon were a big family in the Mohegan community. They created a museum. Gladys was trained as a traditional medicine woman, but she also had a PhD in anthropology from UPenn. So some of her work on Eastern Indian botany is still very much standard. But she also, with her family, collected a lot of artifacts, documentation, and evidence that sort of said the Mohegans have a history as a federal tribe, and throughout the 19th and 20th century, we continued to be a community and a tribe. And lo and behold, a lot of these resources are used with when the Mohegan gain their federal recognition. I'm almost, I think, 3 minutes from where I wanted to stop. So I want to bring it up to the current. So people like Gladys and Joseph Nicolar, who I'm going to just skip, they showed mainstream America, again, visible political activism that maintain and continue to hold Indigenous communities together. And there is hundreds of community leaders in the 19th and the 20th century that have performed similar tasks and played a very important role. All right, so as in Massachusetts, in New England, as in the rest of the country, we also have our history of boarding residential schools, as well as the issue of family separation. Boarding schools, I think, are more familiar, and they're less central, although it certainly happens in New England communities, as in other parts of the United States. Very sad history, taking Native American children away from their families, sending them to boarding schools, where there's high degrees of sexual abuse, violence, abuse of many kinds, and trying to, as one founder of the boarding schools has called it, kill the Indian, quote unquote, and save the man. The other issue that's going on, and that's especially a sad case, is family separation in Maine, which was outlawed by the federal government in 1676. But in Maine, for whatever reason, it continued for another 30 years. And it's a big snafu up in Maine right now. If you want to learn more on that, check out the documentary Dawnland, which is an interesting insight into what's going on there. At the same time, we already talked about state and federal recognition. So that is a big thing. Land claims. Native Americans were able to reestablish some of their communities in New England. It's a very vibrant period of activism, Native American activism, and Indigenous nationalism and Indigenous sovereignty, and Native American communities, like other communities of color and neglected communities, especially in rural areas, are dealing with questions of economic and cultural revitalization, very similar to other communities. And the other big factor that's playing out right now is that of language preservation. But we're right at 11:50, which is when I said I would stop. So, and I'm gonna try to get the stop share done, and here we are.
Wow, thank you.
Professor, I have a question.
Yeah, Luis, go ahead. And you can call me Christoph, please.
Yeah, good morning, Professor Ludi, Professor Rosal. When I hear you talking about the colonization, just remind me exactly what happened where I come from. I am from Central America, Honduras, and that's kind of the same thing happened with the colonization, even worse, because we don't even have laws to protect any colonial era. But my question refers about the research of history. Is when historians are researching, do you compare what it was written, in this case, by the colonizers, the people who came, because mostly of the history, as much as I know, was written by the people who came and not by the people who was here before. So in my case, for example, I was taught I have to memorize primary school, middle school, high school, university, that for us, the best that could have happened was the Spanish colonization. It was until years later when I learned that all the atrocities that happened when most of the population was eradicated. But I think until current historians were discovering those things, but I don't recall, haven't seen any book written by, in my case, by Lenca or Chorty or any other autochthonal civilizations. And I'm sure the same thing could be happening here. So the question is there is a way in which history can be corroborated by the writings, by what people who used to live in these areas or down there wrote. That's the first. And the second, similar, which is something more official, as I said before, when I was in primary school and secondary, middle school, by official books and by official methodology of teaching, I was taught and memorized that the best that could have happened for us is learning the Spanish colonization. And even now, when my son was working something about the Christopher Columbus, and I told him, you shouldn't be writing those things that put in Columbus as a good figure, because he killed thousands of people. They stole wherever. And at that point, my wife got mad against me because she said that you are you are telling him something wrong about our roots. And I told her, yeah, but our roots are not Columbus. Our roots came before Columbus, and those roots were totally eradicated. The problem is that neither you or me received that education. I learned it very, very recently in my life. But for us, that's what we were told, that the best thing that had happened was the colonization. And then something came into my mind at this moment. I remember when I was a kid and I used to watch those Italian Western movie and all those movies about the United States, and all of them always put the Indians as a bad guys, as the bad guys of the movie. So that's something that we learned. That the best that might have happened was the colonization. I don't even speak any native language. I just learned Spanish, and I can assure that very few people know something about local languages. So that's my question.
Yeah, in fact, in the boarding schools, the languages were beating out of you. I talked to a lot of Haudenosaunee elders who had gone through the boarding schools and experienced a lot of abuse. So they didn't even teach their own children the language. And so this is why, in many ways, there's such a language death. Luis, this is a very complicated question. I think, there are similarities between the Americas. The way I try to do it in my research methodologically, I look at, as a historian does, I look at the written records, but I also look at them very critically. But I'm also what is called an ethnohistorian, which is a person that draws from anthropology. So I also look at oral histories, and I look at a lot of archaeology. And if I can find something that seems to be supported by three things, then I say it's a slam dunk. If it's only in the records, but the archaeology or the oral history doesn't play it out, then I become critical. And then I'm often in my writing, and the older I get, I do this more and more. This is what so-and-so says. This is what so-and-so says. I don't really know what really happened. And I think that's what we try to do in history, with history a lot. And especially when you're dealing with things that are thousands or hundreds of years ago, the evidence is just not there. So this is a very kind of like vague answer to what was a very good question, and just keep plugging away. And this is why I do these talks at libraries, at schools. I do teacher trainings with especially primary school teachers, because at Massachusetts, I'm sort of trying to like put out seeds. And I think people want to learn more. They want to learn more about the history. The people are understanding that the complexity is there. And I mean, most people in Massachusetts don't even connect like genetically to many of these Puritans that were here. And frankly, I also don't think that we're should be held accountable for the things that were caused by our forefathers. At the same time, when bad things happen, we should be cognizant about it, and we should realize, well, we have a collective responsibility as a society to gain better understanding and try to ameliorate some of those things that have in the past, and provide people from communities that have been traditionally neglected, first off, with an understanding why communities have been traditionally neglected, but then also figuring out ways to lift, that the boats of everyone become lifted. And maybe that's a very romantic view that I have, but here we are. Great question, Luis.
So, Christoph, we're in a 400th anniversary kind of cycle of a lot of big things happening. I mean, some of it I think got obscured with the COVID, but 2030 should be a big year. And I wondered, are there many efforts? Because you see all these plaques around the state left over from the 300th anniversary, and some of them could really use some additional commentary. And I wonder if you know of other efforts underway to really have a more, I don't know, balanced history, available to the general public through something like these plaques, or, which are kind of important. And it's important also to not to throw away what they said 100 years ago.
Yeah, no, I think that's,
have some additional comment. I mean, great educational tool. And they're all
Now-
over the place, really. I mean, they're, what, do we have commissions working on that or anything like that, to your knowledge?
Not of my knowledge. 1620, as you pointed out, I think was, I think there's a commission for 1620, and they did quite a bit with the Wampanoag Indians. But I also think, I mean, like Deer Island is one of those examples of, there's still no memorial up there. There's a tiny plaque hidden sort of at the side of the island that sort of speaks, but in very vague terms of what was really what many Native Americans consider a concentration camp, and getting sort of an understanding what happens to the communities like in Nishabi that end up there, and they're getting annihilated. Because when they return, there are not many people that used to be in relatively large communities that are returning. So something must have happened, right? And so you're piecing it together, but yes, no, we need to do a better job. And just like, as I say, with the state seal, this is a teachable moment. This is when we should have the discussion that Stephen, you and Luis, you raise up. This is stuff we ought to talk about. Yeah, I agree. And I think we need to do a better job of that. And so hopefully maybe in 2030, there will be more, but we shall see.
I mean, I don't know if there are any other states that actually have a Native American on their state flag. I'm not sure, but in a way, that's a kind of a good starting point. You know, and the name of the state is of Native American derivation. So I don't know, we got something to work with here.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think, unfortunately, we can and should do a better job with it. And I think we're all trying our part as educators, as students that are trying to learn. But yes, there's a whole lot more improvement that can be done, especially compared with other what has happened in other societies.
I know you're chomping at the bit to get to a meeting.
Oh, it's just a 7-year assessment, right? So it's my colleagues can handle it, but I know you guys have a meeting too.
Okay, I have a question though. Not that you or I could be telling people what they should be looking for, but when you think about kind of the huge pushback and dismissal of calls for reparations to African American communities in the country, how would you, if you were to be in the position of an advisor, say to Indigenous peoples here, how could they frame the injustices of the past in a manner that might get those who have this notion of like, my daddy worked hard to get where he is, and why should we be giving anything back to people that we never offended, or that, you know, that you're familiar with the kind of dismissal that would be. So how could you get a message across so that people would be open to that and see that, yes, there are reparations that need to be made from a point of view of justice?
I think that in the context of African American history, the situation is a little bit different, and that's really not my area of expertise. I don't think that Indigenous communities actually need me to give them advice, because I think they're pretty much on the ball themselves, and they don't need another white guy telling them what to do. I think there's already a lot of legal activism. A lot of Native American friends of mine are getting trained to be lawyers, language teachers. So they're trying to like work within their communities on a small scale through the legal system, but also through grants to revitalize. And it's an uphill battle. As with a lot of underrepresented communities, what might need to happen at the federal level is more money. We also could use a legal system that is maybe a little bit more open-minded. But what has happened in the last 4 years to the judicial system and appointment-wise is not leaving me very hopeless. So I think that the struggle is real, and I think it's going to get a lot harder for the years to come, because what's happening, yeah, and things like COVID and the impact that has on elderly everywhere, but then especially in Native American communities, and those are the keepers of language and culture. It's depressing.
Right there. On the question, say, of something specific like the statue of Hannah Duston, when there are calls for the statue to be removed versus something like, well, put a modifying notification near it so that we don't lose the fact that we had a very racist history there as well. What would you, like, if you were kind of dragged into a city council meeting at Haverhill to give your perspective on it, what would you be saying to the kind of the city elders, so to speak?
Oh, that let the hate mail come, because it always happens. I get the angry Puritan descendant email about once a week. Some of them are quite colorful, and I'm like, why do you care? This is like you're fighting a war about something that's 400 years, and you're like arguing about terminology here that makes no sense. I think the statue as it stands right now is not working. One can put it into a museum and sort of put a contextual exhibition around it. One could also maybe be a little creative and get some Indigenous artists involved, get a counter statue going that would require some money, get some students involved, research projects, art projects. I think there's fantastic ways that students and Indigenous artists could help to contextualize this. If it involves some grant money to pay people, students and artists, it'd be terrific. And so one doesn't necessarily have to get rid of the statue, but then it needs to be contextualized and been brought into this context of the history of white supremacy, making comparisons with the South. And I know that it's very unpopular in Massachusetts, but I mean, again, we're the first ones with slavery, right? And so we are not as squeaky clean in New England than we sometimes like to think of ourselves. And so again, that would be mine. So think about it in various options. And then once that kind of public learning process has happened, maybe then people can come up to more educated, do we really need the statue, or should we really just put it into a museum, or maybe get rid of it? So I'm not really giving a specific answer here, Dermot, but just playing out some ideas.
Very good. Like one of the things that I had never thought would be the case was at one of these city council meetings, a woman who is a descendant of Hannah Duston makes her living reenacting the story, but of course a very specific version of the story. And like people like that are saying, you are today attacking my livelihood by like even what you've been saying today, you would probably take as a direct attack on her livelihood. And so yeah, I can see how it's the past is never just the past.
Yep. And the culture war continues on so many layers, and people really get emotional about this. And again, I mean, I grew up in Germany, and I've had these discussions with my father in the 1980s about, I'm like, oh, hey, that's about the Wehrmacht, and my father was in the Wehrmacht, and I'm like, yeah, and they went out and they did horrible things. And so, but the culture there now is like, for example, you walk through the inner cities there and you have little markers called stumbling blocks, where then you have the names of Jewish people that used to live in a house and then were brought into concentration camp, and you have a little summation of their life history, where they perished, what camp, and sort of as a reminder of what horrible things had been done. And I think we can do some growing in that area in the United States.
Very good.
Maybe I have a question about. First of all, I apologize. I was like 99% late. I only got the email yesterday and didn't see it till this morning. Which,
Don't worry, Andrew, you made it. That's
seeing as there are, I'm not. You're not saying that that would be the only solution to trying to make social justice here, right? Like counter statues or small memorandums of people's lives. But even in Germany right now, where they are probably hyper aware of racism because of World War II, there are Nazis right now. There were stories in this past year about military leaders and police being actual Nazis. What else? Like, it may be hard to even propose a solution to this sort of thing, but outside of these like soft ideas, like putting statues up, what do you think can be done?
I think you're never going to reach a hardcore. There is like, I don't know what the actual percentage is. There is just people that thrive on that kind of hate and that are so misguided that I unfortunately don't think it can be done. And I mean, I'm very critical in terms of the German environment too. You know, you can do this kind of stuff with the Nazi Holocaust, but let's think about the German history of imperialism in Africa. And then the story is all of a sudden, oh no, we can't. And so again, yeah, so it's a very complicated, Andrew, you're right. And I'm not proposing this is the only way. I'm just throwing them out there. And unfortunately, you're never gonna win everyone, but that shouldn't stop you from trying. And like, okay, so you get a nasty email once a week. I'm like, all right, fine. I sometimes actually bother to respond to people, and maybe that's an idiotic thing too. But you then never hear back again. And I think it's also what the important part of history and the humanities and why events like this and the work of your professors and your teachers and your work matters is that you try to remind yourself that you're dealing with human beings and that just like this is why I'm always respectful to these people that you have your right to give me your peace of mind. But then, like I said it, but from a perspective, and then like think of the 6 kids or the 10 people killed by Hannah Duston and their story. We need to acknowledge that story too. And this is why I'm like, I understand why Hannah Duston might have done what she did. She made a lot of money with the scalps. She had her own child killed. She was probably traumatized. And was dealing with all kind of PTSD and then probably, as some historians have suggested, a history of violence and abuse in the family anyway, which the Hannah Duston family doesn't like to talk about as much. But anyway, so yes, I think about human beings and remember the stories. And you can never reach everyone, but that shouldn't stop you from trying. So, but good question, Andrew. Everyone, very good questions.
Well, one last comment. What I have read in my history book is that all for centuries there is one society who jump over to another society and colonize another society, and that have been read. I have been reading this for the last 10,000 years, to say something. So it's part of our nature, I might say, or I might think.
No, I think you might have a point there too, Luis. And at the same time, just because it's done doesn't make it okay.
Okay, well, if nobody has anything else right now, I'll take this opportunity to thank Professor Christoph Strobel again. Thank you, Christoph.
Thank you, guys.
We will continue to try and send you excellent students from Northern Essex.
Please do.
And this is really a testament to why we need a strong history program at Northern Essex and why the humanities are really important, that we can't just be techies or we can't just be into STEM, but we need to reflect on the human experience. And this is a very powerful way of kind of bringing the history of our own local area to mind. So I really, really appreciate that. And hopefully long after this students will be watching this and want to come and join you at Lowell. So thank you.
Yeah, and maybe hopefully next time we can do it in person.
That would be great.
Yeah.
Yes, that would be
So
truly
yes, because this Zoom stuff, and because usually I don't like to lecture all that long, and it's annoying. But the Zoom thing is just not. It's just hard to do it. It's much easier to be all in the same room. So hang in there, guys, and good luck. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you everybody who came today.
Dr. Louis, Andrew, thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Louis.
Bye now.
Bye. Okay.